What would you do if your mom called you while she was fast asleep? It all started on my drive back from a Halloween party. I was living in Chicago at the time, but the party was in the suburbs, so the drive back was about an hour or so. It was late, and I was already a little on edge from the overall creepiness that comes with Halloween night. The dark streets, the weird costumes, the fog hanging over everything. You know how sometimes the air just feels different? That night was one of those nights. I was halfway home when my phone rang. I glanced down at the screen and saw my mom's name pop up. That struck me as odd because my mom lives in Cleveland, 2 states away, and she never calls me late. She's the kind of person who's in bed by 9 p.m. at the latest, so a call from her close to midnight was strange. I thought maybe something was wrong, so I answered immediately. Nothing. Just silence. At first I figured it was a bad connection. Maybe she'd pocket-dialed me or something. I said hello a few times, but got no response, just this weird, heavy breathing, not loud or exaggerated, just there in the background. I hung up, figuring it was some kind of glitch, but I called her back just to be safe. She answered right away, but she sounded groggy. I apologized for waking her and asked if she'd just called me. She said no, she'd been asleep for hours. I laughed it off, assuming it was some weird phone issue, and hung up. But then it happened again. Not even 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with another call from her number. I was still driving, still on a dark stretch of road, and now I was starting to feel a bit weird about it. I answered. And again, just the breathing. This time it felt like it was closer, more deliberate, like someone was listening carefully but didn't want to speak. It wasn't my mom. I knew that much for sure. I didn't call back this time. Instead, I texted her asking if she was really sure she hadn't tried to call me. She didn't respond immediately, which made sense because she was probably back asleep. So I brushed it off again and kept driving, telling myself it was just some weird tech issue. Maybe her phone was malfunctioning or something. I finally got home to my apartment in Wicker Park, a nice but older neighborhood in Chicago. My building was one of those classic old ones with creaky floors and thin walls, which added to the overall eerie vibe that night. I parked in the lot behind the building, locked my car, and walked inside. I live alone, so the quietness when I stepped into my apartment didn't feel unusual at first. I locked the door behind me, tossed my stuff on the couch, and checked my phone again. Still no response from my mom. I figured she was probably asleep again, and I didn't want to wake her twice in one night. But then, about 15 minutes later, my phone rang again. Same number, same silence, same breathing. This time I hung up immediately. I was seriously freaked out. What the hell was going on? I sat on the couch for a bit, staring at my phone and trying to make sense of it all. I texted my mom again, asking if she was sure she hadn't called me earlier since her number kept popping up. Finally, she responded, saying she hadn't touched her phone since our last conversation and was a little annoyed that I kept waking her up. Not wanting to worry her, I apologized and told her I'd figured it out. But I hadn't, and it wasn't over. The call stopped for a while after that, so I eventually tried to calm myself down. I made myself some tea, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. I told myself it was probably just some technical issue. Maybe her number was somehow glitching and being spoofed by telemarketers or something. It sounded stupid, but I was grasping for any explanation that would make sense. But the more I sat there, the more unsettled I felt. I couldn't shake this weird tension, like I was waiting for something else to happen. The apartment felt off. I'm used to it being quiet, but that night, the silence felt different, heavier, like the walls were holding in the stillness. I sat up, checking my phone again out of habit. No calls, no messages, it was fine. But I couldn't sit still, so I started walking around the apartment, flipping lights on as I went. My place isn't huge, just a one-bedroom, but that night it felt bigger. Every dark corner seemed to stretch a little farther than it should. At some point, I realized I was basically pacing the length of my apartment, from the living room to the kitchen to the bedroom and back again, like I was looking for something that wasn't there. I went to the windows, double-checked the locks, peeked out into the empty street below. It was all normal. Quiet. Dead quiet. I went back to the living room and grabbed my phone, scrolling through social media to distract myself. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. In my call log, where all the missed calls and received calls are listed, there were 3 calls from my mom's number, all from that night. I expected to see that. But right above those calls, right before the first one, I saw another missed call. Same number, my mom's number. But this one was from earlier in the night, around 10 p.m. when I was still at the party. I hadn't noticed it before because I wasn't checking my phone much during the party, but seeing it now gave me a chill I couldn't explain. Why would she have called me then? And why didn't I notice the missed call until now? I opened my text messages again and scrolled back to the conversation I'd had with her earlier that day. Everything seemed normal. No signs of anything out of the ordinary. I debated calling her again to confirm that she hadn't tried to reach me earlier, but I didn't want to freak her out in the middle of the night. Besides, what would I even say? It seemed absurd to ask if she was sure her phone wasn't haunted, and the thought sounded ridiculous even in my own head. Instead, I decided to let it go and head to bed. I was exhausted, and I had to be up early for work the next day. I double-checked the front door, made sure it was locked, and went to my bedroom. I plugged in my phone, set it on the nightstand, and climbed into bed. As I lay there, I couldn't stop thinking about the calls. I kept telling myself it was some sort of technical glitch, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't let me fully relax. I turned over, stared at the clock for what felt like forever, and finally drifted off to sleep. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up again. I didn't hear anything specific, just that feeling you get when you know something isn't right. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. My phone was buzzing. Another call from my mom's number. I didn't answer it this time. I couldn't. I just stared at the screen as it rang, my hands cold and clammy. When it stopped, I checked the call log again. Same pattern as before. But this time, there was a voicemail. My breath caught in my throat as I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play button. I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. Not right then, not in the middle of the night while I was alone in my apartment. I turned off my phone completely, plugged it back in, and forced myself to lie back down. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep. But every time I started to drift off, my mind would wander back to that voicemail, sitting there, waiting. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented, like I hadn't really slept at all. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt too bright, almost harsh after the weirdness of the night before. For a few moments, I debated whether I should even bother checking the voicemail. Part of me wanted to just delete it without listening, but I knew that would only make me more anxious in the long run. So with my heart pounding, I turned my phone back on and opened my voicemail. I hit play. It was the same sound I'd heard on the calls the night before, just breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. But there was something different about hearing it in a voicemail, like the silence between breaths was heavier. It lasted for about 15 seconds before cutting off abruptly. That was it. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, not sure what to do next. I felt like I should call my mom, but I didn't want to freak her out or make her think I was losing it, so I did nothing. I just deleted the voicemail and tried to move on with my day. But that sense of unease didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, I kept waiting for another call, another weird voicemail. But nothing happened. It was almost worse in a way because I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Every time my phone rang, my stomach would flip, even if it was just a normal call. Eventually, though, I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Life went on, work got busy, the holidays came and went, and things started to feel normal again. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not even my closest friends, because it just sounded too bizarre. It felt like one of those things that was easier to pretend didn't happen. You know that creaky sound when a door opens? Imagine hearing it when you're alone at midnight. This was back in 2019. I was living in Milwaukee, in a small house I'd bought a couple of years earlier. It wasn't in a bad neighborhood, but it also wasn't the best. It was just one of those average places where everyone mostly keeps to themselves, and you might wave at your neighbors in passing, but no one really hangs out. My job was demanding, so when I wasn't at work, I was usually home just trying to relax. That night, though, still haunts me, even though nothing physically happened to me. It was Halloween night, but since I didn't have any big plans, I'd just come home from work, made myself dinner, and settled in to watch some mindless TV. I'd had a long day, and I wasn't really in the mood for all the Halloween festivities happening outside. The kids had already come and gone for trick-or-treating, and the street had mostly quieted down by the time I locked up the house for the night. My house is pretty small. 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and a small guest room I use as a kind of office storage space. There's also a basement that I rarely go into unless I need to store something, and a small backyard that leads out to an alley where we keep the trash bins. I've always been pretty good about locking all the doors and windows, but on Halloween I'm especially careful. The last thing I wanted was some teenagers trying to pull a prank on my house while I was inside trying to unwind. By the time it was getting late, maybe around midnight, I was stretched out on the couch, half asleep, watching some random sitcom. The only light in the house was coming from the TV. My mind was wandering, thinking about work, when I heard it. The unmistakable creak of a door opening. It wasn't the TV. The sitcom I was watching was loud enough that I knew it wasn't just background noise. The creak came from inside the house. I froze, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. My heart started racing as I muted the TV and listened. At first, there was just silence. Maybe it was nothing, I thought. Maybe I'd left a window slightly open and the wind had pushed something. But no, I'd checked the windows earlier. They were all locked. I sat up, trying to keep calm, and grabbed the remote. But then I heard it again. Another creak, louder this time, like someone had just pushed a door open and then stopped. The sound was so familiar because it reminded me of the closet door in my guest room. The hinges were old and squeaky, and they made that same slow creaking noise whenever I opened it. That's when it hit me. I was alone in the house. I had been sitting there, relaxed, thinking I was alone. But what if I wasn't? I glanced around the living room, trying to figure out if I should get up or stay where I was. My phone was on the coffee table in front of me, but my eyes drifted toward the hallway that led to the guest room and my bedroom. The hallway was dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the entrance. I stared at it, waiting for some sign that I wasn't imagining things. I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the smallest sound to confirm my growing fear. And then it happened. A soft thud, like something gently tapping against the wall. That was it. I had to do something. My first instinct was to grab the nearest thing I could use as a weapon. There was an old wooden bat leaning in the corner of the living room, one I kept around for no particular reason other than nostalgia from my baseball days. My hand wrapped around it, my fingers sweaty, as I slowly stood up from the couch. I walked to the hallway as quietly as I could, the bat held tight in my hand. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears as I tried to stay calm. I stood at the entrance of the hallway for what felt like forever, just staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just tired and hearing things. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The guest room door, the one I always kept closed, was slightly ajar, not fully open, just enough for me to see the darkness beyond it. I know for a fact that I had closed that door earlier. I'd checked it before locking up for the night, just like I always did. There was no reason for it to be open now. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, slowly making my way down the hallway toward the door. The bat felt heavy in my hands, and every step I took felt like I was walking into something I couldn't control. When I got to the door, I hesitated. My hand shook as I reached out to push it open all the way. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the dark, cluttered room. My eyes darted around, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No one. Just the same old boxes and random junk I'd stored in there months ago. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Maybe I'd left the door cracked earlier and forgotten. But as I turned to leave the room, something caught my eye, the closet door. It was slightly open, too. My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the closet in weeks. There was no reason for that door to be open. I stood frozen in place, staring at the sliver of darkness between the closet door and the wall. The guest room was already cold, but in that moment it felt like the temperature dropped even more. I took a step closer to the closet, my hands tightening around the bat. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I had to make sure I was alone. With my heart racing, I reached out with my free hand and grabbed the edge of the closet door. Slowly, I pulled it open. The closet was empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension in my chest start to ease. I was being paranoid, jumping at shadows and noises. I closed the closet door firmly, making sure it was latched this time, and walked back out into the hallway. But just as I was about to turn off the hallway light and go back to the living room, my phone buzzed. The sudden sound startled me, and I nearly dropped the bat. I hurried back to the couch, grabbed my phone, and glanced at the screen. It was a message from my neighbor, the guy who lived in the house next door. My stomach tightened as I read the message. He said he'd seen someone trying to get into my house. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who? When? I frantically looked around the living room, my eyes darting to the windows, the door, trying to piece together what was happening. Had someone actually been outside? Had they gotten in? The uneasy feeling I'd had all night came rushing back, stronger than before. I grabbed my phone and quickly typed a reply, asking if he was sure and what exactly he had seen. But before I could hit send, I noticed something. The closet door in the guest room was open again. Wide open. I don't know how I missed it before, but as I stood there staring down the hallway, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The door had been closed, I knew it had been. I'd just checked it myself, but now it was open. Something or someone had opened it while I was in the other room. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been hiding in the house the whole time? Had they slipped into the closet while I was walking around? I felt my breath quicken as I realized how vulnerable I was, alone in the house with no one nearby to help. I backed away from the hallway, keeping my eyes on the open closet door, my phone in one hand and the bat in the other. I was too scared to move, too scared to even call for help because I didn't know if whoever was in the house could hear me. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, every sound around me amplified by the silence. I kept waiting to hear something, footsteps, a creak, anything that would confirm what I already knew, that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the deafening silence. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, my heart racing, my hands shaking. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I knew I had to check. I couldn't just stand there all night, waiting for something to happen. I slowly made my way back to the hallway, inching toward the guest room. The door was still wide open, the darkness inside seeming to stretch farther than it should. I couldn't bring myself to look directly into the closet, but I knew I had to. My hands were clammy as I gripped the bat tighter, ready for whatever was about to come. I stood just outside the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered inside. Nothing. Again, it didn't make sense. I had seen the door open. I knew I'd closed it, but once again, the closet was empty. My mind was spinning, trying to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. I was alone in the house. There was no one there. But that didn't stop the feeling that someone had been, or still was, inside. I didn't sleep that night. After making sure every window and door was locked, I sat on the couch with the bat beside me, the lights on, waiting for morning. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was moving. But nothing else happened. By the time the sun finally came up, I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to bed. I texted my neighbor again, asking for more details about what he had seen. He said he thought he'd seen someone walking around the side of my house, but when he went to check, they were gone. He didn't see a face or any clear details, just a figure moving in the dark. I didn't call the police. I didn't think they'd take me seriously, especially since I didn't have any proof that someone had actually been in the house. A late-night walk with my dog turned into a nightmare when I realized someone was silently following us home. This happened to me a few years ago, but I still think about it a lot. It was Halloween night, which made it feel more unnerving, but nothing about it felt like a Halloween prank or anything. It felt very real and very scary. I live in Portland, Oregon, and at the time I was renting this small house in a quiet neighborhood not far from Laurelhurst Park. It's a nice area. Older houses, big trees lining the streets, and usually a lot of people out walking their dogs or jogging. That night, though, it felt like the whole neighborhood was asleep. Halloween fell on a Thursday that year, so most people had already wrapped up their celebrations by the time it got late. I had taken my dog, a medium-sized rescue named Sadie, for her usual evening walk. It was around 11 p.m., which wasn't unusual for me. I liked the quiet of the late-night streets, and Sadie needed to get her energy out before bed. Plus, it gave me a chance to unwind after a long day at work. The walk started out normally enough. We left the house, turned down our usual route toward the park, and everything seemed fine. The air was cool, and the streets were pretty much deserted. It wasn't until we reached the end of my block that I noticed him. He was standing at the corner, just under the street lamp. I didn't pay much attention to him at first, because there's nothing weird about seeing someone standing around in the neighborhood. Maybe he was waiting for a ride or taking a break from walking. He was wearing dark jeans, a hoodie with the hood up, and he had his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I didn't get a good look at his face, but that didn't seem strange either. It was dark, and the streetlight was casting long shadows. Sadie didn't react to him at all, which was a little unusual because she's typically alert around strangers. I pulled her leash a little tighter as we walked by him, but I didn't get any bad vibes at that point. We passed him and turned the corner onto the next street, and I didn't think much more about it. A few blocks later, I was starting to relax. Sadie was happily sniffing around, and I was just enjoying the quiet. It was a calm night, no wind, no sounds except for the occasional car in the distance. But as we were nearing the next intersection, I glanced back, just out of habit, and that's when I saw him again. He was about half a block behind me, walking in the same direction. My first thought was that it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby and was heading home. Or maybe he was out for a late-night walk like I was. But something about it felt off. He was walking just slow enough to keep a consistent distance, but not so far behind that I couldn't tell he was following the same route. I started to feel uneasy, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, this was Portland, and people walk around at night all the time. Still, I picked up the pace a little, hoping that maybe he'd turn off on a different street. But when I glanced back again, he was still there, matching my speed. At this point, I was getting nervous. I decided to take a longer route back home, one I didn't usually take. I wanted to see if he would follow me or if it was really just a coincidence. I turned down a side street that curved away from the park, leading toward a busier road. There were still streetlights, but the houses were spaced out more, and there were fewer places for someone to be just standing around. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying not to look back too often, but every now and then I'd steal a glance over my shoulder. He was still there. If anything, he'd gotten a little closer. I started running through scenarios in my head. Maybe he wasn't following me. Maybe he was just some guy heading in the same direction. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to convince myself of that. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was close to a busier street where there were more houses and more people, but it wasn't helping. I thought about calling someone, but who? It wasn't like I had any real evidence that something was wrong, and I didn't want to freak out over nothing. So I decided to turn onto a street that would loop me back toward home. It was a bit of a gamble, but I figured if he turned with me again, I'd know for sure. I took the turn, pulling Sadie a little closer to me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back right away, but I could hear footsteps behind me. Just quiet enough to not be totally obvious, but steady enough that they stood out in the silence of the street. When I finally did glance back, he was closer than ever, maybe 20 feet behind me now. His hood was still up, and I couldn't see his face, but the way he was walking felt deliberate. He wasn't just some guy out for a stroll. He was following me. There was no question anymore. I tried to keep my breathing steady as I sped up even more, practically pulling Sadie along with me. She was getting anxious, sensing that something was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get home. The worst part was that I didn't want to lead this guy straight to my house. The thought of him knowing where I lived made my skin crawl, but I couldn't think of what else to do. I was too far from any stores or businesses, and there weren't any people around to ask for help. I felt completely alone. I turned one last corner and my house was in sight. I'd managed to put a little more distance between us, but I could still hear his footsteps behind me, echoing in the quiet street. I was almost there, just a few more yards to the front door. I had my keys in my hand, ready to unlock the door the second I reached it. When I finally made it to my front steps, I didn't look back. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking, and threw open the door, practically dragging Sadie inside with me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there in the entryway, catching my breath, trying to listen for any sounds outside. I didn't hear anything at first, but after a few seconds, I forced myself to look through the peephole. He was standing across the street, just staring at my house. My stomach dropped. He hadn't followed me all the way to the door, but he was still there, just standing in the shadows, watching. I couldn't see his face clearly through the peephole, but I could tell he was looking directly at my house. I backed away from the door, trying to figure out what to do. Call the police? What would I even say? That some guy followed me home. I hadn't seen him do anything illegal, and he hadn't tried to get inside or hurt me. But I didn't want to just sit there and wait for something to happen. I went into the living room and turned off all the lights, hoping that if he couldn't see me, he'd eventually go away. I kept peeking out the window, waiting to see if he'd move, but he just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Finally, after what must have been at least 15 minutes, he started to walk away, slowly, casually, like nothing had happened. He didn't look back, didn't do anything to indicate he was in a hurry. He just walked down the street and disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was he? Why had he followed me? Was it just some random guy messing with me, or was there something more to it? I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been targeted, that he'd been watching me before I even noticed him. The next day, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus on anything, and every little noise made me jump. I told a couple of friends what had happened, but they didn't seem to take it as seriously as I had. They kept saying it was probably just a guy trying to freak me out because it was Halloween, or that I was overreacting. But I knew it was more than that. The way he'd followed me, the way he'd stood across the street watching my house, it wasn't just a prank. He had a purpose. I just didn't know what it was. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I walked Sadie, I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking to see if he was there. I even started changing up my route, taking different streets every night, just to avoid running into him again. Nothing ever came of it, though. I never saw him again. But even now, years later, I still think about that night whenever I'm out walking alone. It's left me with this permanent sense of unease, this nagging thought that maybe he wasn't just some random guy. Maybe he was planning something, and I just got lucky that nothing happened. I don't know what his deal was, and I'll probably never know. But I'll never forget the feeling of being followed like that, of knowing that someone had been watching me for who knows how long. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, even if nothing technically happened. I guess that's what makes it worse, in a way. Nothing did happen, but it could have. What started as a harmless Halloween stop for snacks quickly turned into a terrifying chase by a masked stranger. This happened in 2018. It was Halloween, and my friends and I had been out at a party in the city. I was living in Denver at the time, near Capitol Hill, which is a pretty lively area with lots of bars, restaurants, and shops. We'd been at a house party for a few hours, nothing wild, just drinking and hanging out. By the time we decided to head home, it was probably around midnight. There were 4 of us, me, my friend Julie, and 2 other friends, Sarah and Tom. We'd been drinking, but none of us were drunk, just a little buzzed and tired, ready to call it a night. Instead of taking an Uber straight home, we decided to stop by a convenience store to grab some snacks for the road. I know, real smart decision-making, but at the time it seemed harmless. The store was one of those 24-hour places on Colfax Avenue, not far from where we were. The area was usually busy, but being Halloween, the streets were quieter than usual. We parked nearby, went inside, and started wandering around the aisles, looking for chips, drinks, and whatever else caught our eye. The store was empty except for the guy behind the counter, who barely acknowledged us when we walked in. As we were laughing and talking, I noticed a man walk into the store. He was wearing a plain white mask, like the cheap kind you get from a Halloween store. The ones with no details, just 2 empty eye holes. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was Halloween after all, and people were still dressed up from earlier in the night. But there was something about the way he stood there, just inside the entrance, that felt off. He didn't go to any of the aisles. He didn't move toward the counter. He just stood there, watching us. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was with someone who was already in the store, or maybe he was just waiting for us to move out of the way. I kept shopping, but I found myself glancing at him more often than I wanted to. I thought maybe I was the only one who had noticed him, but after a few minutes, Julie gave me a look. She'd noticed too. We didn't say anything to the others. We just kind of stayed near each other and kept moving through the aisles, trying to ignore him. Eventually, we made our way to the register to pay for our stuff. The guy was still standing there, blocking the entrance, which made it impossible for us to leave without walking right past him. As we checked out, he finally moved. But instead of going to get something, he just followed us with his eyes. I paid for my stuff, grabbed my bag, and turned toward the door, trying to act like everything was fine. The whole situation had started to feel creepy, but I didn't want to make a scene. As we walked out, the guy finally moved from the spot where he'd been standing. I thought maybe he was going to buy something now that we were gone, but instead he stepped outside right behind us. We made it to the car without saying anything about him, but my mind was racing. Was he following us, or was it just a coincidence? I wasn't sure, but I felt uneasy. Sarah and Tom didn't seem to notice anything weird, so they just kept chatting and getting into the car like it was no big deal. Julie and I exchanged another glance, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing as me. Something wasn't right. We all got into the car, and as I buckled up, I glanced out the window. The guy in the mask was standing on the sidewalk, watching us. He hadn't gone back into the store. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing our car. I didn't say anything at first because I didn't want to freak everyone out. However, when Julie whispered if he was still there, it was enough to get Sarah and Tom to look too. Sarah laughed it off, saying it was probably just some weird guy being creepy, because it was Halloween. Tom shrugged and said we should just drive away and forget about it. I wanted to believe that, but something about the way he was standing there made my skin crawl. We pulled out of the parking lot, and I thought that was the end of it. But as we drove down the street, I glanced in the side mirror and saw him walking. Slowly. In the same direction we were going. He wasn't running after us or anything, but he was walking down the sidewalk, keeping pace with us. My stomach dropped. I told the others, and that's when things started to feel real. Julie turned around in her seat to look, and Tom muttered something under his breath about how this guy was weird. We sped up a little just to put some distance between us, but as we stopped at the next red light, I saw him again, still walking in our direction. We turned down a different street, trying to shake him, and for a while, we didn't see him anymore. I thought maybe we'd lost him, or maybe we'd been overreacting, but then Julie gasped. She was looking through the back window, and I turned to see what she was staring at. There he was, standing at the corner of the street we just turned off of. He wasn't running. He wasn't chasing us. But somehow he'd found us again, and he was just standing there, watching us from the distance. At this point, we were all freaked out. I told Tom to drive faster, and he did, speeding through the neighborhood to get us away from the area. We drove for a while, zigzagging through streets, trying to put as much distance between us and that guy as possible. Eventually, we didn't see him anymore, but the tension in the car didn't go away. We finally made it back to our apartment building, and none of us were talking. I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. What if he found us again? What if he was still following us? I scanned the area as we got out of the car, looking for any sign of him, but there was nothing. We hurried inside, locking the door behind us. Once we were safe inside the apartment, we tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced. The night had gone from fun to terrifying in the span of an hour, and none of us knew what to make of it. We stayed up for a while, watching movies and trying to shake the weirdness of what had just happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about the guy in the mask. How had he found us so quickly after we left the store? Why was he following us? The worst part came when Julie pulled out her phone. She'd lost it at some point during the night, and we assumed it had been left behind at the party or maybe even the convenience store. But when she unlocked it, her face went pale. There was a photo saved in her phone's camera roll that hadn't been there before. It was a picture of us, all four of us, standing in the convenience store, grabbing snacks and laughing. But the angle wasn't from any of us. It was taken from behind the guy in the mask. It was clear he'd taken it without us noticing. He'd been watching us the whole time, and now there was proof. That was enough to send us all into a full-blown panic. We didn't know what to do. How had he gotten her phone? Had he somehow gotten close enough to take it without us realizing? Or worse, had he been inside the store long before we even noticed him, watching us the entire time? We ended up staying up all night, too paranoid to go to sleep. In the morning, we called the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said it was probably just a prank or someone trying to mess with us because it was Halloween. But the thing is, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt intentional. Like he'd been targeting us from the moment we walked into that store. After that night, none of us went back to that convenience store. We avoided Colfax for a while, just in case we ran into him again. I don't know if he was just some random creep trying to scare us, or if there was something more sinister going on. But the fact that he had Julie's phone, that he'd taken a picture of us without us noticing, still haunts me. I've thought about it a lot since then, wondering what would have happened if we hadn't gotten in the car when we did, or if we'd taken longer to notice him following us. The thought of him showing up at our apartment, or worse, inside, is something I try not to dwell on. But every time I see someone wearing a mask, especially one like his, I get that same sick feeling in my stomach. I'll never forget the way he just stood there, motionless, watching us as we drove away. It was like he wasn't even trying to hide it. He wanted us to know he was following us. And that's what makes it so terrifying. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. It's one thing to receive a creepy call on Halloween, but what if they start texting you from inside your house? A few years ago, something happened that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It was Halloween, and at the time I was living with my parents in a quiet neighborhood in Baltimore. It was one of those older suburban areas with rows of 1960s ranch-style homes, all spaced out enough that you didn't really know your neighbors well, but not so far apart that you felt isolated. It was a normal place to grow up, safe, quiet, nothing ever really happened. That Halloween night, my parents went to a party at one of their friends' houses. I was 19, so staying home alone wasn't a big deal. I'd done it plenty of times before, and I actually kind of liked having the house to myself. My parents had left around 7 p.m., and I remember them saying they'd probably be back after midnight. I wasn't really into Halloween, so I didn't have any plans other than staying in and watching movies. The night started out fine. I ordered some takeout, turned on a couple of horror movies, and figured I'd just enjoy the quiet. It was around 9 or so when the trick-or-treaters stopped coming by, which wasn't unusual. Most of the kids in the neighborhood were younger, so they wrapped up pretty early. After I turned off the porch light, the house settled into that comfortable silence that I always loved when I had the place to myself. I was sitting on the couch, halfway through a movie, when the phone rang. It was the landline, which barely ever got used. The only people who called it were telemarketers, or my grandma on occasion, so I didn't really think much of it. I muted the TV, got up, and walked over to the kitchen to check the caller ID. It was an unknown number. I figured it was a spam call, but something made me pick up the phone. I don't know why, I just did. I put it to my ear, but no one spoke. I said hello a few times, but all I could hear was this faint sound of breathing on the other end. Not heavy or anything, just enough to know that someone was there. After a few seconds, I hung up. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably some prank or someone calling the wrong number. It was Halloween after all, and people did dumb stuff like that all the time. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on the movie, but the call stuck with me. I kept glancing over at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. When it didn't, I told myself I was being paranoid and tried to let it go. Then, about 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. I paused the movie this time, feeling a weird sort of tension building in my chest. I went back to the kitchen and checked the caller ID. It was the same unknown number. I didn't pick it up this time. I just stood there, staring at the phone as it rang and rang. After a few seconds, it stopped, and I went back to the living room. But now I was on edge. The house didn't feel as comfortable anymore. The quiet that I usually enjoyed felt different. Like it was too quiet. Like the walls were holding something in. I sat back down, but I couldn't focus on the movie anymore. My mind was running through all the possible explanations for the calls. Maybe it was some kid pulling a prank, or maybe it was someone trying to scare people on Halloween. But the breathing, there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It felt deliberate. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked over and picked it up, not even checking the caller ID. I didn't say anything, just waited. The breathing was there again, soft and steady. Then, out of nowhere, a man's voice came through. He asked for me by name. That was when my stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone I was home alone that night. My parents were gone, and no one else knew I was there, except for a couple of friends who were at a different party across town. The voice was calm, almost friendly, but something about it made my skin crawl. I hung up without saying anything and just stood there for a second, trying to process what had just happened. I wasn't sure what to do. Calling the police felt like overreacting. No one had threatened me, and for all I knew, it could have been someone I knew messing with me. But the fact that they knew my name, combined with the weird breathing, had me seriously freaked out. I walked through the house, double-checking all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. The house was small, so it didn't take long, but as I walked from room to room, I couldn't shake this growing sense of dread. The air felt thick, and every shadow seemed darker than it should have been. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I knew that wasn't true. Something wasn't right. I went back to the living room, turned the TV back on, and tried to distract myself. But the phone calls had thrown me off. I kept glancing over at the landline, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. The silence felt oppressive, like the house was holding its breath along with me. Then my cell phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. I thought it was probably just one of my friends texting me about the party. But when I picked it up, my heart started racing. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple. It asked if I was alone. I stood there staring at the screen, my hands shaking. How did this person get my number? My cell number wasn't something I gave out to just anyone. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I realized that whoever had been calling the house now had my personal number too. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I grabbed my phone and headed for my room, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Was this some sort of joke, or was I actually being targeted? I sat on the edge of my bed, my phone clutched in my hand, staring at the screen, waiting for another text. But nothing came. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and finally, I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had gotten bored or realized they weren't going to get a reaction out of me. I was about to go back downstairs when my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It said they were inside the house. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My head was spinning, and I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run. But where? If they were really in the house, I had nowhere to go. I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no doors opening or closing, just the quiet hum of the house around me. I stayed frozen in place, staring at the text, trying to decide if it was real or just someone trying to scare me. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to believe it. Whoever this was had known I was home alone. They had my name. They had my number. And now they were saying they were inside. I could barely breathe as I got up and tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it, trying to listen for any sound outside. The house was dead silent. Too silent. I didn't hear anything, but that only made it worse. I finally grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. I whispered to the operator that someone had been sending me threatening messages and that they claimed to be inside the house. She told me to stay calm, to stay on the line, and that officers were on their way. But staying calm wasn't an option. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and I was convinced that at any moment I'd hear footsteps outside my door, or worse, the door handle turning. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, my phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the sound of sirens, waiting for something to tell me that help was coming. My mind was racing, picturing every worst-case scenario. Someone breaking down the door, someone already standing in the hallway, someone watching me through the cracks. Then I heard it. A creak, barely audible, coming from downstairs. The floorboards in our house were old, and they made that sound when someone walked across them. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my heart hammering in my chest. The creaking stopped, then started again, closer this time. I could hear footsteps. I stayed as still as I could, trying not to make a sound, praying that the person wouldn't come upstairs. I didn't know what I would do if they did. I didn't have any weapons, nothing to defend myself with, just my phone and my locked door between me and whoever was out there. The footsteps grew louder, slower, as if they were deliberately moving toward something. I sat there, clutching my phone, my entire body frozen in fear, waiting for the inevitable sound of the doorknob turning. Then, finally, I heard sirens. The footsteps stopped, and I listened as the police cars pulled up outside. I jumped up, ran to the window, and saw the flashing lights in the driveway. I didn't waste any time. I unlocked the door, bolted down the stairs, and threw open the front door just as the officers were walking up the path. I could barely speak, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. They came inside, checked the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in any of the rooms, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. But the messages were real. The calls were real. And I knew what I'd heard. The footsteps, the creaking floors. Someone had been in the house with me. The police took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. They said it could have been someone trying to mess with me, maybe someone I knew, but I couldn't think of anyone who would do something like that. I moved out a few months later, and I've never looked back. This was back in 2017 in Pittsburgh. I just turned 25, and I was living in a small apartment near East Liberty. Back in high school, my friends and I were really into urban exploring. We'd find abandoned places around the city and sneak in just to check them out. There's something weirdly exciting about being in a place that's been left behind, with nothing but dust and graffiti to tell its story. One of our favorite spots back then was this old factory just outside of Homestead. It had been shut down for decades. One of those places that just sort of faded into the background as the city grew around it. We must have gone there a dozen times, each time exploring a little further, finding new nooks and crannies we hadn't noticed before. We had a rule back then. No one ever goes alone. It wasn't so much because we were scared of the place, but more because we didn't want anyone getting hurt and having no one around to help. Anyway, life happened, and we all kind of drifted apart after high school. Most of my friends moved away or just got too busy with jobs, families, that sort of thing. I hadn't been back to the factory in years, but for some reason I started thinking about it again. I couldn't really explain why. But it had been on my mind for a while, and one night after a couple of drinks at a bar in South Side, I decided I was going to check it out again. Alone this time. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe just some nostalgia or to prove to myself that I wasn't scared of those kinds of places anymore. It was late October, right around Halloween, so that might have been part of it too. I just had this itch to go back there like it was something I needed to do before I moved on with life or whatever. I drove out to Homestead, parked my car a couple of blocks away from the factory, and made the short walk over. The place looked the same as it had back in high school, old, crumbling, overgrown with weeds and graffiti covering every inch of the walls. The fence was still broken in the same spot, the one we used to slip through, so I crouched down and squeezed my way in. As soon as I got inside, it felt like stepping back in time. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. The rusted machinery, the empty rooms, the cracked windows that let in just enough light to see where you were going. The place had an eerie stillness to it, like the world outside didn't exist when you were in there. I wandered around for a while, retracing the steps we used to take. The big open floor where we'd always end up. The darkened hallways that led to nowhere. The stairwell that collapsed a few years back. It was all just as I'd left it. But then, as I was making my way through one of the smaller rooms off to the side, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. On the wall, scrawled in bright red spray paint, were the words, "Welcome back, Alex." My blood ran cold. Alex, that's me. And I hadn't been back here in years. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here tonight. Hell, I hadn't even thought about this place in almost a decade. The idea that someone knew I was here, or worse, that someone had been waiting for me to come back, sent a chill down my spine. I stood there staring at the graffiti for what felt like forever, trying to wrap my head around it. I thought maybe one of my old friends had been back recently and left it as a joke, but that didn't make sense. None of them still lived around here, and we hadn't talked about this place in years. I snapped a photo of it on my phone just to make sure I wasn't imagining things and tried to shake it off as some weird coincidence. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. Maybe someone else with the same name had been here recently, and it was just a fluke. But the longer I stood there, the more paranoid I got. I decided it was time to get out of there. I turned and made my way back through the factory, but as I did, I started to notice things I hadn't seen before. There were fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, leading in the same direction I had come from. At first I thought they might be mine, but then I realized they were too big. Someone else had been here recently, and they had walked the same path I was walking now. I picked up my pace, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows made me jump. It was like the factory had come alive, watching me as I made my way toward the exit. By the time I reached the fence, I was practically running. I squeezed back through the gap, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was back at my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked at the photo I'd taken of the graffiti again, hoping that maybe it would look different now that I was out of the building. But it didn't. It was still there, plain as day. Welcome back, Alex. I drove home that night in a daze, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Who had written that? How did they know I was coming back? And why now, after all these years? I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words on the wall, glowing in the dark, mocking me. I thought about calling one of my old friends, maybe asking if they'd been back to the factory recently, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I didn't want to admit how much it had freaked me out. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the whole night in my head, trying to make sense of it. I even considered going back to the factory, just to see if the graffiti was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like I'd crossed a line by going back there alone. Then, a week later, something else happened. I was heading out to work one morning when I noticed something strange on my car. At first, I thought it was just dirt or leaves, but as I got closer, I realized it was spray paint. Someone had written on my car, in the same red paint as the graffiti at the factory, asking if I remembered them. My heart dropped. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever had written that at the factory had followed me, or they knew where I lived. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me this whole time, waiting for me to let my guard down. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report, told me they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was just some random vandalism, a Halloween prank or something. But I knew it was more than that. After that, I started noticing little things. My mail would go missing, or I'd hear footsteps outside my apartment at odd hours of the night. Once I found my front door unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it before bed. Another time, my neighbor told me they'd seen someone hanging around my building late at night. But when I asked for details, they couldn't give me much. Just that it was a guy wearing a hoodie, keeping his face down. I stopped going for my usual late-night walks. I stopped talking about the factory, even with myself. I just wanted to forget it ever happened, but it's like whoever did this wouldn't let me. I kept waiting for something else to happen, some other message or sign that they were still out there, but nothing came. Still, the paranoia stuck with me. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like I was being followed. I started carrying a knife with me everywhere I went, just in case, even though I didn't know if I'd ever have the guts to use it. Eventually, I moved out of that apartment. I told myself it was just time for a change, that the place was too small and I needed something bigger. But deep down, I knew I was running. Running from whatever, or whoever, had decided to make me their target. I never went back to the factory after that. I never found out who left that message or why they chose me. But even now, years later, I still think about it. Every time I see a piece of graffiti, I wonder if it's meant for me. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on a dark street, I wonder if it's him.